Insulin resistance rarely announces itself. There is no sudden pain, no dramatic warning, no obvious collapse in health. In fact, many people who develop it look outwardly well. Normal weight, regular exercise, balanced diet. Their blood work may even appear acceptable for years. And yet, beneath the surface, a metabolic shift can quietly begin. To understand why, we need to revisit the role of insulin. Insulin is not the enemy. It is a master regulator. After you eat, it signals your cells, especially muscle cells, to absorb glucose from the bloodstream and use it for energy. In a responsive system, this exchange is efficient. Glucose rises, insulin responds, cells absorb, levels normalize. But insulin resistance begins when cells gradually respond less effectively to insulin's signal. The pancreas compensates by producing more. At first, blood sugar may remain normal because higher insulin levels are keeping it that way. This is why insulin resistance can exist long before someone is diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. A metabolic researcher once summarized it carefully. Insulin resistance is often a hidden phase, normal glucose, elevated effort. That phrase is important, elevated effort. The body is working harder to maintain balance. And what makes this especially surprising is that the shift can occur even in people who consider themselves metabolically healthy. Because insulin resistance is not driven by sugar alone. It is influenced by sleep, stress hormones, muscle mass, liver fat, inflammation, and daily movement patterns, which means someone can eat reasonably well and still drift toward resistance. The real question is not whether insulin resistance is possible in healthy individuals. It is why the body would become less responsive in the first place. And the answer begins in an organ most people rarely think about when they think of metabolism, the liver. Because insulin resistance often starts there, not in the bloodstream, but in how the liver handles energy between meals. When most people think about blood sugar, they picture the pancreas or the bloodstream. But long before glucose levels rise abnormally, a metabolic shift can begin in the liver. Between meals, and especially overnight, the liver releases small, controlled amounts of glucose into the bloodstream to keep your brain and organs supplied with steady energy. Under normal conditions, insulin gently signals the liver to slow that release when glucose is already sufficient. But when the liver begins accumulating excess fat, even in individuals who appear lean, its responsiveness to insulin can subtly decline. This condition is often referred to as non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, NAFLD, and it is far more common than many realize. When liver cells store excess fat, their internal signaling pathways shift. Insulin's message becomes less effective. The liver continues releasing glucose even when it should be holding back. The pancreas responds by producing more insulin to compensate. Blood sugar may still appear normal, but insulin levels rise quietly in the background. A hepatologist once described it this way: the liver sets the tone for metabolic balance. When it becomes resistant, the rest of the system follows. What makes this especially important is that fatty liver can develop in people who are not visibly overweight. Genetics, stress hormones, sleep disruption, and sedentary habits all influence how the liver processes and stores fat. And once liver insulin resistance begins, it does not remain isolated. Because muscle tissue, the body's largest glucose sink, soon begins responding differently as well. And when muscle stops absorbing glucose as efficiently, the metabolic shift accelerates. Because muscle insulin resistance changes how your body handles energy every time you eat. If the liver sets the metabolic tone, muscle determines how much glucose can be cleared after a meal. Skeletal muscle is the body's largest site of glucose disposal. After eating, insulin signals muscle cells to open channels that allow glucose to enter and be stored or burned for energy. But when muscle cells become less responsive to insulin, that transfer slows. Glucose remains in the bloodstream longer. The pancreas releases more insulin. Compensation continues. Over time, this reduced responsiveness is recognized clinically as insulin resistance. What surprises many people is that this shift does not require obesity. It can develop in individuals who appear fit but have lower levels of metabolically active muscle tissue. Muscle acts like a sponge for glucose, but only when it is regularly stimulated. Prolonged sitting, reduced strength training, or aging-related muscle loss can all reduce that sponge's capacity. An exercise physiologist once noted, An active muscle is metabolically quieter muscle, and quieter muscle absorbs less glucose. This is one reason why someone can exercise occasionally yet still experience metabolic drift if large portions of the day are sedentary. But muscle and liver are only part of the story, because insulin signaling is also influenced by inflammation. Subtle, chronic inflammation that may not produce pain or visible symptoms. And that inflammatory background can interfere with the way cells interpret insulin's message. The next shift happens not in one organ, but at the cellular signaling level, because inflammation can change how insulin is heard. Even when it is clearly spoken, not all inflammation is visible. You don't always feel it. It doesn't always cause swelling or pain. But at a cellular level, low-grade chronic inflammation can quietly interfere with insulin signaling. When inflammatory molecules circulate persistently, often influenced by stress, disrupted sleep, excess visceral fat, or ultra-processed diets, they can alter the way insulin receptors function on the surface of cells. Insulin may still bind, but the internal message becomes distorted. Instead of efficiently activating glucose transport pathways, the signal weakens. Cells hesitate to open their glucose channels fully. The pancreas compensates by releasing more insulin. Blood sugar may still appear normal, but behind the scenes, effort is increasing. One of the biomarkers researchers often associate with this background inflammation is C-reactive protein, CRP. Elevated CRP doesn't prove insulin resistance on its own, but it frequently travels alongside metabolic dysfunction. An endocrinologist once summarized it carefully. Insulin resistance is rarely about sugar alone. It's about the cellular environment, and that environment is shaped daily by stress hormones, sleep patterns, physical activity, and diet quality. Which brings us to another often overlooked factor, one that affects even highly disciplined, health-conscious individuals. Because you can eat clean, exercise regularly, and still unknowingly stress one of the most powerful metabolic regulators in your body, your stress response system. And when that system stays activated longer than it should, insulin signaling can begin to shift, even in people who otherwise appear healthy. Because the next driver of insulin resistance doesn't come from food, it comes from hormones designed for survival. Your body is built for survival first, optimization second. When the brain perceives stress, it activates the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, leading to the release of cortisol. Cortisol has a clear job: increase available energy. It does this by stimulating the liver to release more glucose into the bloodstream and by making tissues slightly less sensitive to insulin, a protective mechanism designed for short-term survival. In a true emergency, this is efficient, but modern stress is rarely brief. Deadlines, financial pressure, chronic sleep restriction, constant digital stimulation. When cortisol remains mildly elevated for extended periods, insulin signal becomes persistently challenged. Cells respond less efficiently. The pancreas compensates with higher insulin output. Blood sugar may still test to normal, but the effort required to maintain that normality increases. A metabolic physician once put it simply: stress hormones and insulin operate in tension. When one rises chronically, the other must work harder. What makes this particularly deceptive is that many healthy individuals pride themselves on productivity, often sacrificing sleep and recovery in the process. And sleep deprivation alone can reduce insulin sensitivity measurably within days. Which means insulin resistance is not merely about diet quality. It is about cumulative metabolic pressure, liver fat, reduced muscle stimulation, chronic inflammation, elevated stress hormones, fragmented sleep, individually manageable, together transformative. But here's the critical insight. Insulin resistance is not an on-off switch. It is a spectrum, and the body remains highly responsive to change, even after the shift has begun. Which leads to the most important question of all. Not, can healthy people develop insulin resistance? But, how early can the metabolic drift be detected and redirected? Because the final phase of this story is not about inevitability. It is about reversibility. By the time fasting glucose rises noticeably, insulin resistance has often been developing for years. What makes this metabolic shift so deceptive is that it hides behind normal numbers, at least initially. Fasting glucose may sit comfortably within range, A routine checkup may look reassuring. Body weight may appear stable, but insulin levels can already be elevated. Clinicians sometimes assess this using measures such as fasting insulin test or calculations like HOMA-ER, tools that estimate how hard the body is working to maintain glucose balance. In early insulin resistance, glucose stays normal because insulin output increases. The system is compensating. But compensation has limits. Over time, persistently high insulin levels can promote increased fat storage, greater hunger signals, rising triglycerides, subtle increases in blood pressure. These changes often cluster under what physicians call metabolic syndrome, a pattern that signals elevated long-term cardiovascular risk. Yet here's the part that often gets overlooked. Insulin resistance is dynamic. Muscle tissue remains adaptable. Liver fat can decrease. Inflammation can quiet. Stress hormones can stabilize. Sleep can restore sensitivity within days. The metabolic system is not fragile. It is responsive. A preventive medicine specialist once noted, the earlier insulin resistance is recognized, the more reversible it tends to be, which brings the entire discussion into focus. Healthy appearance does not guarantee metabolic resilience, but metabolic resilience is not fixed. It reflects the cumulative signals your body receives: movement, rest, stress, nourishment. And once you understand that insulin resistance often begins silently, the more useful question becomes, what signals is your metabolism responding to right now?